Now we have the literature review. So we had to get rid of a few different studies because they looked too much at the hip. The sample size was too small. And for the third article that we excluded, looked too much at the strength of the hip and not necessarily as much about its range of motion or how factors in the ankle can affect the hips biomechanics in the squat. So the first article that we'll go through looked at frontal plane prediction angle, also known as FPPA. This angle is essentially a vertical line that bisects the leg into two different halves, okay? And it will determine the valgus of an individual should they exhibit a knee moving medially towards the midline of the body because they don't have adequate range of motion at the ankle. Okay, this angle also is a good predictor of ACL injury because when the angle is not able to fully facilitate the range of motion put on it, by demand, the knee will travel in towards the midline of the body. Essentially, the tibial plateau and the medial epicondyle of the femur will start to distance themselves from one another. This will put a stretch and, therefore abnormal stress on the anterior cruciate ligament. This will highly increase the likelihood of injury, which is something you want to avoid, especially in an athlete, older population, or those looking to rehabilitate and correct current patterns in the squat. So the study essentially determined that inadequate dorsiflexion causes internal rotation at the hip. The internal rotation at the hip will therefore create valgus at the knee. Okay, so this valgus, again, is abnormal stress on the ACL. And it was also shown that elevating the heel reduced this valgus and actually produced better range of motion at the knee joint, thus creating a deeper squat. Okay, so the overall message is improving ankle dorsiflexion capabilities can, up the chain, improve biomechanics. The second article was split between men and women, so there was no mixed pool, which is good because it actually found that there were different factors that men and women needed to improve upon, depending on gender and your limitations. So, for men, it was found that exhibition of good dorsiflexion with a flexed knee. Okay, this is important because my project uses exclusively flexed knee range of motion. And hip range of motion, namely external and internal rotation, not flexion or extension, are crucial to achieving a deeper squat depth. Deeper squat depth is associated with greater strain on the quads, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that your squat will become highly leg extensor dominant. So it's not necessarily about whether or not your knees are pointed forwards or externally rotated. It's about how low to the ground you can get your squat to get the quads more highly involved. So for women, it was found that ankle dorsiflexion with an extended knee and strong ankle dorsiflexors were important to achieving that deeper squat depth. There was nothing about hip range of motion because by default women actually do have better flexibility at the hip joint, so this would create a redundancy in the findings. So it essentially ended by suggesting that exercises to improve both the hip and ankle range of motion and strength will improve your overall squat performance, whether it be single-legged or bipedal. The third article examined the relationship between ankle range of motion and loading mechanics. So these loading mechanics were specifically derived from landing mechanics. So jumping off of a 30-inch box was the name of the game, and the dominant leg would land on a force plate. This force plate would determine the ground reaction forces on the individual. So that essentially means how hard is the landing? Okay, how stressful is it on the joint structure? So there was actually a positive relationship between better performance or dorsiflexion range of motion and reduced knee valgus with smaller ground reaction forces. So essentially, if you were able to exhibit better dorsiflexion at the ankle, you would have essentially a safer landing and a more technically sound landing. So you might be asking, why is this important for a external loaded squat? The reason being, a landing is essentially the same as a squat in the sense that you are both externally loading the body and you are both landing the same way you would squat, which is your body's optimal way of handling a load. So that depends on the person. It's also a good way to determine what your squatting form should look like. So if you jump off of a box, your feet will land where your body believes you are strongest. This is also a good marker for, finding your ideal squat position. So because the landing and the loading of a squat are very similar, I figured that there would be, a rather intelligently placed correlation between the two. So the fourth study looked at differences between extended knee passive range of motion at the ankle and flexed knee range of motion at the ankle. It turns out there are no differences between the normal group and the limited dorsiflexion group when it comes to an extended knee and passive dorsiflexion at the ankle. There are, however, greater differences with knee valgus, knee flexion, and dorsiflexion displacement at the ankle between the two groups when the knee is flexed. So essentially this means that the group with better dorsiflexion exhibited greater knee varus, greater knee flexion, and greater dorsiflexion displacement at the ankle, which essentially just means greater dorsiflexion. So the normal group actually performed better on the overhead squat and the single-legged squat. And it also concluded that improving dorsiflexion range of motion in the lunge with an external load is a great way to actually improve your motor patterns for a more technically sound squat form, thereby, and also calling back to a previous study, reducing the risk of ACL injury. Now, this study is actually the most important because my study actually looks at single leg squat performance when dorsiflexion and leg strength are taken into account. Okay, so because this study also determines that dorsiflexion is a critical factor in performing a single leg squat, it, albeit only one study, still provides more strength towards my hypothesis that you can actually perform a single leg squat should your ankle dorsiflexion be adequate and your leg strength be adequate.